This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are TNT Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Hi Tanya.
Hi Talia.
Hi listeners.
Hello everyone.
Thank you for joining us again this week because we have a great episode. I'm almost certain, Tanya, you do not know about this case.
Really?
Yes.
I'm excited.
Our story starts out on December 26th, 1871.
1871?
It is interesting, though. On December 26th, 1871, it was a cold day in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Chelsea, Massachusetts is located directly across the Mystic River from Boston. It's only a few miles away. On that day, two unidentified men heard this faint noise. It was the cry of a young child. The sound was coming from this old, nasty, smelly outhouse on top of Powderhorn Hill, which is just on the outskirts of Chelsea. When the men opened the outhouse door, they were shocked to see a half-naked young boy. He was about 3 or 4 years old, and he was dangling from the roof beam by a rope that was wrapped around his wrists. His eyes were closed, his mouth was bluish-purple, he was limp, and you would have thought he was dead except for the fact that there were those tiny whimperings coming from him. His torso was bare, he was naked from above the waist, and it was discolored too. Even more appalling was the little boy's back. It was covered in massive welts. The men took out a knife and they cut down the little boy from the beam. This boy was so traumatized that he wasn't even able to say anything to them. He couldn't say who did it. He couldn't even say what happened. Eventually, they were able to identify the boy. And he was 4-year-old Billy Payne. Billy Payne didn't offer any viable information, so the person or persons that did it did not get caught. About 2 months after the attack on Billy Payne, February 21st, 1872, the parents of a little boy named Tracy Hayden contacted the police, and the police came to their house. When the police arrived there was a doctor that was treating little Tracy. Little Tracy was laying on his belly. His eye was swollen. His nose was broken. His upper lip was split. His front teeth were busted out of his mouth. And this is what he told the authorities happened to him. Tracy told the police that he was playing outside when, quote, a big boy with brown hair came up to him and asked him if he wanted to go to Powderhorn Hill to see the soldiers. Powderhorn Hill, from my understanding, had soldiers there. It wasn't a fort. I couldn't really figure out everything, but I know some soldiers were staying there. Little Tracy said, yeah, I'd love to go see some soldiers. When he got to Powderhorn Hill, he got led closer to an abandoned outhouse. All of a sudden, Tracy was just overpowered by this boy, and he stripped off Tracy's clothing. He took a handkerchief and he stuffed it in Tracy's mouth, and then he tied his hands and feet to the roof beam, just like what happened to Billy Payne. Once poor little Tracy was tied to this beam, the older boy started whipping him with a hard stick. And then the older boy got in his face and said, I'm going to cut off your penis. The older boy wasn't successful in cutting off Tracy's penis, but he did cause damage to little Tracy's genitals. After all that happened to Tracy and Billy, they still weren't able to give the police anything to really go on, except that whoever was sadistically assaulting them was an older boy. 3 months after the assault on Tracy on May 20th of 1872, a little 8-year-old boy named Robert was playing outside when an older boy approached him. This boy asked Robert if he'd like to go to the circus with him. Coincidentally, the route to the circus passed by Powderhorn Hill. So Robert and this older boy walked in the direction of Powderhorn Hill, and as they were walking up the hill, they had to pass this pond. All of a sudden, older boy grabs him by the arm and tries to push him into the pond. And he managed to break free from the older boy's grasp. Robert turned to the older boy and said, "What are you doing? Why would you do something like that to me?" And the older boy hit him upside the head and knocked Robert down to the ground. The older boy then dragged Robert into an isolated outhouse. Robert was dragged into this isolated outhouse and he was stripped of his clothing. Then a cork was stuffed in his mouth. It's a milk cork from like a bigger...
a big cork.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Robert was tied with some clothesline to a post in the outhouse. The older boy started laughing and jumping around as he started torturing Robert. He would pull the cork out of Robert's mouth and force Robert to say really nasty things like prick, shit, and kiss my ass. As he was torturing Robert, this older boy's breathing became very labored, and he put his hand in his overalls and started touching himself. After a few minutes, the sadistic boy let out a moan, leaned against the outhouse wall, and he instantly calmed down. He cut Robert from his restraints, ordered Robert to put his clothes back on, and he let Robert go. As you can imagine, the whole Boston area is freaking out. On a hot summer day, on June 22nd of 1872, 2 months after the attack on Robert, a 7-year-old boy named Johnny was being a typical 7-year-old boy. He had pancakes for breakfast. Then he played games outside with his friends. After a few hours of playing games outside with other boys, he knew it was time to go home, so he started heading home for dinner. He wasn't in a big hurry. He was seen dawdling up and down the streets, and he walked past a toy shop called Polly's Toy Shop. He went up to the glass window to get a better look at some of the toys in the storefront, and he was really fond of this particular toy called Captain Kidd's Castle. But it cost $2 and he didn't have any money. Suddenly, somebody tapped him on the shoulder. The stranger asked Johnny what his name was, and then asked Johnny if he wanted to maybe earn some money. So Johnny went with him. The stranger told Johnny that he would take him to a guy who had some money, who needed some errands done. And they began walking towards Powderhorn Hill.
Oy vey.
As you walk up Powderhorn Hill, there's a brickyard, and then you pass the brickyard to the abandoned outhouse. As Johnny was being led to the outhouse, the older boy attacked him, grabbed his shirt, dragged him into the outhouse, slamming the outhouse door. Johnny was told if he made any noise at all, he would be killed. Then this older, creepy boy tore off Johnny's clothes, took out a rope from his pocket he conveniently had, and he tied Johnny's hands together. Then he tossed a rope over a beam, and he hoisted Johnny up. Then this boy took off his belt, and he began flogging Johnny. He beat him on his back, his belly, his thighs, and his butt. But he was particularly focused on beating Johnny in the genitals. This creeper boy started breathing really heavy. Then he let out a loud moan, and the torture stopped. The whole entire incident took about 10 minutes. The rope that was suspending Johnny was caught by the perpetrator, and Johnny fell to the ground. The creepy older boy told him, if you leave this outhouse, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to slice your throat. Johnny was left naked on the floor of the outhouse, which was extremely hot because it was July, and smelled extremely awful because it's a shit house. He was there for over 2 hours when a man named Frank walked by and heard the very faint cries of Johnny. When Frank actually opened the outhouse door, he saw Johnny, who was only maybe semi-conscious at that time, and his body was marbled with purple and blue bruises all over it. Johnny didn't really have a lot of information to give the police to help them anymore with this investigation. So the police were no closer to catching this really, really sadistic boy. Neighborhoods started their own vigilante groups, and they were armed with guns. And this assailant was now known as, quote, the boy torturer. About 8 months after the first assault on Billy Payne, in August of 1872, there was a 7-year-old boy named George Pratt who decided to go for a walk along the beach in South Boston Bay. George was a bit frail because he just recovered from having a bout of the German measles. He was walking around where the ocean meets the sand looking for treasures. After walking for a few minutes, he realized he wasn't alone. There was an older boy now walking beside him. This boy told George that he needed some help with an errand, and he offered George 25 cents for his assistance. George was led to an abandoned boathouse. Not outhouse, boathouse. I don't know what abandoned boathouse is, but they did describe it as having shit in it, so I don't know. Once inside the boathouse, George got hit really hard upside the head, and a filthy handkerchief was stuffed inside his mouth. He was then stripped naked, his ankles and wrists were bound with rope, and the older boy began taunting him. He said, quote, "You've told me 3 lies, so now I'm going to lick you 3 times. And when this boy says lick, he does not mean like a popsicle. He means whoop your ass. George was completely stunned at first. The more terrified George became, the more animated and excited this older boy was. He was feeding off of George's terror. The boy torturer took off his belt and began almost dancing around as he was flogging George. He then started kicking George in the head and the stomach and between the legs. He dug his fingernails into George as deep as possible and left deep scrapes all over him. The older boy then bent his head, leaned into George's face, and bit a chunk of George's cheek off. George began to lose consciousness, but the perpetrator would slap his face to try to keep him awake. To add to the torture, oh, this is bad, the older boy pulled out a thin, shiny object. It was a long sewing needle, and he began poking George all over his body with a sewing needle, including his groin area. He tried to pry George's eyes open to put the needle in, but George kept his eyes closed. While George was fighting, all of a sudden he feels something very painful on his ass cheek. The boy torturer bit a chunk of his right butt cheek off. Eventually the boy torturer became satisfied, and he ceased tormenting George. A few hours later, some fishermen found George, and he got rushed to the hospital. Now the public was just beyond outraged. They wanted someone's head on a platter. The police had so much pressure to figure out who was doing this. They determined that the perpetrator had to be slow or mentally ill because nobody in their right mind would possibly be into torture. So they rounded up, quote, every half-witted boy in the greater Boston area and interviewed him. But they weren't able to figure out who it was. Time went on. Weeks went by. Approximately 3 weeks after the attack on George in September of 1872, this really, really screwed up boy torturer struck again. And each time he struck, his violence escalated. His next victim was a 6-year-old boy named Harry Austin. Harry was lured to an area under a railroad bridge in South Boston. Once he was there, the older boy stripped him of his clothing, beat him mercilessly. But this time, the boy went even farther, and he pulled out a pocket knife. He stabbed little Harry under each arm and between the shoulder blades. All the while, he was laughing and cursing. Then he grabbed the little boy's penis, and he tried to cut it off. He almost succeeded. It was halfway cut off.
Ooh.
Harry managed to survive. Only 6 days after the attack on little Harry, a 7-year-old boy named Joseph Kennedy was lured by an older boy near the salt marshes of South Boston Bay. His head was slammed into the wall of the building, and he was stripped naked. He was beaten. His nose was broken. His teeth were knocked out. And the perpetrator busted out a pocket knife. He forced Joseph to kneel, and he made Joseph recite the Lord's Prayer, only he made him add in obscenities in the middle of the prayer. Joseph refused, and as a result of his insolence, he was slashed on his face, his back, and his thighs were cut. And then the boy torturer brought him into the salty marsh and laughed at him as he screamed in agony from the salt water hitting his wounds. None of these children were able to give any real helpful information about the perpetrator. From what I read, and I read a book called Fiend by Schechter, the boys were so traumatized, and they were young, that they really weren't able to provide much of anything worthwhile.
They're probably scared shitless.
The only thing the police knew was the boy was described as older, he was Caucasian, he had brown hair, and the frequency of attacks was increasing and the violence was becoming even more savage. On September 17th, 6 days after the attack on Joseph, little Robert Gould was playing near his house when he was approached by another boy who asked him if he wanted to go see some soldiers who were marching in a parade. Robert had never been to a parade, so he was really excited. I don't know where the parents were for all this.
I was just thinking, wouldn't he have had to ask his mom?
Robert followed behind the older boy as they started walking towards some railroad tracks. After quite a while walking, Robert was like, hey, I'm getting really tired and I'm not seeing a parade or soldiers. And in fact, he realized that he was in an area where there was actually no one else even around. So when he actually said something to the boy torturer attacked him. He stripped him, just like he did the other boys, and he tied him to a pole. Then the boy torturer pulled out 2 knives, and he began slashing Robert while he was dancing around excitedly. He slashed Robert on the head, and he slashed Robert under the eyes and behind each ear. Then he put one of the knives to Robert's throat, and he said, "You'll never see your mother and father anymore. You stinking little bastard. I'm going to kill you." Suddenly, the older boy stopped because he could hear the sound of some railway workers approaching, and he took off and he started running away. The workers found Robert. He was bound and he was bleeding, but he was able to provide more information than any of the other children were. And he told the police something very important. He said the perpetrator was, quote, a big boy with a funny eye. He went on to describe the older boy's right eye as being, quote, milky, like the color of milk, and marbled. The police knew now they were looking for a boy with a marbled eye.
How many boys could there be with a milky marbled eye?
That's like a very
distinct
characteristic. 4 days after the attack on Robert, Joseph Kennedy, the boy that was forced to recite a twisted version of the Lord's Prayer, went around to schools with a police officer. He went class to class looking for the perpetrator. And they went to all the schools. Although Joseph did go to the class of the boy torturer, the boy hid his face, so Joseph didn't recognize him. A few hours later, after Joseph went with the police to the schools, Joseph was back at the police station talking to the police, and a boy peered in the police station door. A police officer saw the boy, and the boy immediately took off running. The police officer followed him and grabbed his arm, and when he turned the boy around, he saw he had a marbled eye. Joseph was with him, and he exclaimed, "That's him! It's it! That's him!" And they knew they had their perpetrator. His name was Jesse Pomeroy, and he was 12 years old.
12? I'm dying to know about Jesse now.
I'm going to tell you about Jesse. Jesse's mom's name was Ruth, and she married his dad named Thomas. And together they had 2 sons, Charles, Jesse's brother, and Jesse. Jesse was born on November 29th of 1859. An interesting note, when Jesse was an infant, he became very ill. He started getting boils and ulcers that were oozing, and they caused his eye to be disfigured. His mom thought he wasn't going to survive. He had a high fever, and the illness lasted almost a month, I believe, but he did survive. Whatever it was, and they are not sure what it was, it made his right eye blind. Obviously, the children teased him, because that's what
kids do.
At a very young age, he didn't really interact that much with other children, unless they wanted to play Scouts and Indians. He loved Scouts and Indians. Particularly, he loved having prisoners of war. He would come up with ways to kill his captives, such as skinning them alive, roasting them at the stake, slicing off bits of flesh, and making them eat their own body. That was described by his childhood friends as some of the things he enjoyed. When Jesse was about 5, his mom purchased some canaries. She noticed that the canaries' heads were twisted off by someone, and she believes it was Jesse. And another example of Jesse's perversion, when he was, again, about 5 years old, a neighbor caught him in her yard, and he had a kitten in his hands. The kitten was covered in blood and had been stabbed in the throat and the chest and quote-unquote other body parts. The neighbor asked him, what the hell are you doing? And he turned to her and he said, "This is my little kitty." Right around the time that Jesse started attacking the kids, his parents got separated. Jesse's dad, Thomas, was an alcoholic who believed in beating his wife and punishing his sons severely to teach them lessons. For example, Jesse recalled one time he ran away from home and his father tracked him down. His father dragged him back to the house, stripped him naked, and whipped him repeatedly with a belt. Before that, he skipped school and his dad stripped him naked and whipped him in a woodshed. Jesse confessed to the police, and he said, "Yeah, I am responsible for it. I did it." He said he absolutely could not help himself. He was overcome with the urge to
torture these kids,
yes.
Right?
So what do you do with a 12-year-old like Jesse? You can't just lock him up and throw away the key. So what the state of Massachusetts did is they sentenced Jesse to the Massachusetts House of Reformation for the term of his minority, which means until he was 18. And that's 6 years. At the time Jesse began his sentence, he was 12 years and 10 months old. The Massachusetts House of Reformation is basically a juvenile home for boys ages 10 to 16. It housed roughly 250 boys. If the children misbehaved, they were flogged. Jesse often would seek out whoever was the most recently flogged child and ask questions such as, "How hard were you hit? How did it feel?" However, his behavior there was exemplary. And on Wednesday, March 18th, 1874, they released him.
Wasn't it only a couple years later?
Yes, he was 14 years old.
I thought he was sentenced until he was 18.
He was really well behaved.
I guess. Okay.
So he is now back on the streets of Boston. He was released to the care of his mother, who promised she would make sure he was put to work. His mom had opened up a little tiny sewing shop on Broadway Street in South Boston, and in front of the shop, his brother Charles had a newspaper stand, and Charles also had a paper route. So Jesse helped out with his mom's store and helped Charles with the paper route in his store. All was well in the streets of Boston until March 18th. Little Katie Curran, who was about 10 years old, needed a notebook for school, and her mother was usually very protective of her. But that morning, she was busy helping Katie's little sister Celia get ready for school, and she told Katie, listen, take a couple coins from my purse, go down to Tobin's store, it's just down the road, and get yourself a notebook. Come right back. At 8:05 a.m., Katie put on her jacket, put on her scarf, and she started to leave the house. She turned to her mom, and she said, have Cecilia ready when I get back. I've got a new teacher, and I don't want to be late for school. Those were the last words her mother would ever hear her say. On that Wednesday, Jesse opened up his mom's store for her at about 7:30 in the morning. As he was sweeping the store, a neighborhood boy named Rudolph came by, started talking, shooting the shit with Jesse. Rudolph would often help the Pomeroys with the paper out and the shop from time to time to earn some extra money. So while he was talking to Jesse, Katie stopped by. She had been to Tobin's, but Tobin's didn't have any notebooks, so she asked Jesse, hey, is there a notebook on the newsstand? And there was one notebook, but it was used. Just as Katie goes to purchase it, Jesse's cat, a little tabby, comes up from the cellar and starts meowing. And Jesse says to Rudolph, hey, go over to the butcher and get some scraps for my cat real quick, and I'll give you some change. Rudolph runs over to the butcher, brings some scraps back, and there's no Katie. Katie's gone. He assumes Katie went home. At 9 a.m., Katie's mom started getting really worried because she'd been gone an hour and school was starting. She went to the Tobin store, and the owner there said, yeah, Katie was here, told her we didn't have anything. Then Katie's mom, Mary, bumped into a girl named Lee, who said, yeah, I saw Katie. She was by the Pomeroy store. And Mary was terrified. She went to the police, and she literally said, you need to help find my daughter. She was last seen with that Jesse kid. The police captain assured her, listen, Katie's all right. We'll find her, relax, and he sent her home. The following day, Katie still wasn't back. And Rudolph told the police, I last saw Katie with Jesse. Mary came to the police station and asked, what's going on? What progress has been made? And while she was there, a witness came forward saying, I saw Katie. Katie was being forced into a covered carriage by a man. The police told her, you don't have to worry about Jesse. Jesse likes boys, not girls. And Rudolph, he's a known liar. The police also reassured Mary, we're going to find whoever took her in this covered carriage. Weeks went by, and there was no Katie. Do you think we might want to stop for a few seconds?
Yes. Can we do a shameless plug to Leah?
Yeah, you want a shameless plug?
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to do an infomercial, and we'll be right back. Hey, everyone. If you go to our website, tntcrimes.com, you can find full unreleased episodes available for individual purchase. You can also join our membership, where you get unlimited access to all of our unreleased episodes and early releases, mini episodes, and so many other awesome things. So go to tntcrimes.com. And thanks again for all your support. All right, we're back. Are you ready to hear some more?
Yep, I am ready.
A man named Joseph Millen moved his family, which included his wife and two young sons, Horace and Sidney, to South Boston. They actually moved into the home located directly across the street from Katie's home. On April 22nd, a month after living there, after having a big breakfast, 4-year-old Horace started begging his mom for some money to go to the bakery. His mom acquiesced to his demands, gave him a little bit of money, and told him he needed to come back by lunch. He's 4.
I know, I'm like...
He's 4. Couldn't even tell time? How do you even know when lunch is? She noted that the time was about 10:20 a.m. About 15 minutes after he left, Horace was spotted by a neighbor in the company of an older boy. She asked Horace, hey, where are you going? And Horace was really excited. He said, I'm going to go to the bakery. A few minutes later, another neighbor saw Horace leave the bakery with a piece of cake. The neighbor saw the older boy take Horace by the hand and let him out of the sight of the watchful neighbor. About 40 minutes after that, a man saw 2 boys walking along what's called McKay's Wharf. The taller boy was leading the smaller boy by the hand, and this man assumed that they must be brothers. These 2 boys were spotted around noon by another child, and they were near the beach. This witness saw the bigger boy help Horace across a ditch, and they were headed for the marshes. A little while later, a man was digging for clams on the beach, and he saw this teenage boy sprinting across past the railroad tracks. He thought the boy was being chased because the boy kept turning around and looking over his shoulder, but there was never anybody following him. Later that same day at 3:45, 2 brothers were walking along the beach, and they came to a clam bake pit scattered with empty clamshells about 12 feet from the waterline. Do you know what a clam bake is? Apparently, it is not where you get stoned in a small area with friends. A clam bake is where you dig a rectangle pit and you put stones down and you heat the stones up. And there's some more to it. And then eventually you put the clams on it and you cook the clams. So as I stated, these 2 brothers were walking along the beach and they came to this clam bake pit. Scattered around were all these empty shells. And there was the body of Horace on top of him. He was laying on his back and his body was already stiff.
Oh,
I know, it's sad.
Poor little Horace.
He's just so little. He's 4. His underwear and pants were down around his ankles, and blood was all over his face, all over his hands, and all over his legs. Blood was coming out of his mouth. He was stabbed in the eye. His hands had been smashed. He was stabbed at least 18 times in the chest, and his genitals were mutilated. The 2 brothers freaked out, and they ran for help. Police from Station 9 arrived. When the police from Station 9 came, they noticed that Horace's hands had been clenched in such a tight fist that his fingernails gouged his palms. His neck was cut so deeply he was almost decapitated. His eye had been gouged out, and he was partially castrated. One of the detectives there noticed the MO seemed very similar to the boy torturer, but he was under the impression the boy torturer was locked up. The police from Station 9 reached out to Station 6 and told them about what was going on and said, hey, this seems a lot like the MO of that boy torturer that we locked up. That's when they were like, he's out. So the police went and obviously wanted to have a talk with Jesse. When Horace Fields returned home for lunch, his family started looking for him, and about 5:30 that evening, they went to the police, and that's when they were told, we found your son. When the police brought Jesse in for questioning, they noticed he had scratches on his face, scratches on his hands, and scratches on his neck. He had a pocket knife, which they believed was the weapon that was used to kill Horace. At the clam bake pit, there were 2 sets of fresh shoe prints. One was small and one was bigger. They were able to make a plaster cast out of the larger shoe print, and it matched, of course, Jesse's shoes. Jesse confessed, and he said, quote, something made me do it. He said he was sorry, and he asked the police to please not tell his mom.
Okay. God.
Because he's only 14.
I know, kids
That's
are
why.
stupid.
As you could probably guess, Jesse's mom's business and Jesse's brother's business started floundering. And about a month after Horace's murder, his mom had to close up her sewing shop. That building became unoccupied, and a local grocer wanted to expand his grocery store, so he decided to go and buy the building. He hired some people to help renovate the building, and when they went down into the cellar, it smelled really, really bad. In the cellar was a toilet. I don't know the toiletry of 1874. However, they said there was a clogged toilet, so they assumed that the stench there was from that toilet being clogged for months. In the cellar was a furnace, and it also had a pile where the coal is that you put into the furnace, and then there's a pile of ash, so when you take the coal out after it's been used, you stick it in the ash pile. And then there was the bathroom. In the process of renovating the building, the new owner actually got hands-on, and he started knocking down a wall in the corner by the pile of ash. And he'd been swinging all day, so he swung and he missed the wall, and he hit the pile of ash, and the axe pick he had got caught on what he thought was a rusty bowl. But it was not a rusty bowl. In further examination, it had long, brown, wavy hair attached to it. It was the body of little missing Katie. She was there for 4 months before they found her. The police had reassured Katie's mom that they had checked the cellar just to give her peace of mind, but they didn't, because this isn't a big cellar. Clearly, Katie wasn't kidnapped by anybody in a covered carriage. Instead, Katie was the only female victim of Jesse Pomeroy. An autopsy done on Katie determined that her throat had been slit, her clothing had been cut down the middle, and she had been sexually mutilated. Eventually, after some pressure, Jesse confessed to killing Katie. He explained that he lied to Katie, and he told her that he had more notebooks in the cellar, so she followed him trustingly down into the cellar. And then when she was about midway into it, he grabbed her from the back and he put his arm around her throat and he covered her mouth and then he slit her throat. He didn't describe any of the sexual mutilation that occurred. He kind of skipped over that part. The police asked him, "What's going on? Why are you doing these things?" And he said, quote, "I don't know. I can't help it." Then he pointed to his head and he said, quote, "It's in here." He told the police it was never his initial intention to kill them in these remote locations. But once he got there to these areas where there was conveniently no one around, he would start getting a pain in his left ear, and this pain would pass from one side of his head to another. And then after the pain, he would have this overbearing urge to hurt the victims. And the urge was so strong, he couldn't contain it. But again, I call bullshit on him not having some premeditated plan of murder.
Come on.
So after Jesse confessed, he recanted, then he confessed, and he recanted. Eventually, he went to trial in the winter of 1874, at the end of the year. A jury of 12 men found him to be sane, and they found him to be guilty of first-degree murder. Under Massachusetts law at that time, the punishment for premeditated murder was death, and only death. There was no discretion. However, the jury adamantly requested that the state of Massachusetts commute Jesse's sentence to life in prison because they were really uncomfortable putting a 14-year-old boy to death. Because back then, Tanya, you get put to death, you're going to the gallows. At the sentencing, the judge turned to Jesse and advised him, quote, of the importance of turning your thoughts to an appeal to the eternal judge of all hearts in preparation for the doom which awaits you.
That's really foreboding.
The judge then ordered Jesse to die by hanging. So nobody was really comfortable putting this 14-year-old boy to death. They kind of stalled it. for as long as they could. I mean, they stalled it for years. And while Jesse was in jail, a former playmate of his named Willie got busted for stealing some whiskey, and he was thrown in jail too. Jesse was so excited. He had a friend in jail. They couldn't hang out and play like the old days, but Jesse managed to sneak some letters to Willie. And I'm going to read just a couple excerpts of these letters to Willie because it really gives you an idea of what's going on in, we'll call him Crazy Jesse's head. Friend Will, of course you know what I'm here for and what I was sent to the reform school for. Tell me, what is it and what I did? Tell me all you have heard of me, everything bad, and don't think I'll be angry. Tell me what you thought when you heard of what I did. Tell me all you heard and what the boys said. Did you go to Winthrop School? I've heard they flog boys unmercifully there, and that Willie, a different Willie, got into a row with a master, and the man whipped him till the blood ran down his back, and until Willie was almost killed. Is that a true story? Answer all questions and write a long letter, and believe me, your friend, Jesse. This is letter 2. Friend Willie, I received your note. Now will you please reply to the question I wrote in my last letter? Do you get a licking very often? Tell me if you do, and tell me of the hardest whipping you ever got. Tell me all the particulars of it, and I will tell you all the hardest floggings I ever got. Do not forget to tell me, for if we are to be friends in here, we ought to tell each other everything about ourselves. Will you tell me, as I ask you, about the hardest whipping you got, if it hurt much, and how it was done to you, and I'll tell you about the hardest one I got. Also tell me all you have heard about me doing to those boys. Don't forget, write me a long letter.
It is so gross.
I have another letter he wrote, Will. Dear Will, your account of the whipping is amusing. Tell me more about it. Did it hurt very much, and was your clothes off at the time he did it? I will tell you about the hardest licking I got. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. I played truant and stole some money from my mother. My father took me into the woodshed, and I had to strip off my jacket and vest and 2 shirts so as to leave my back naked. Father took a whip, and he gave me a very hard whipping. It hurt me very much, and every time I think of it, I seem to be undergoing the flogging again. Another severe flogging I got was in July of 1872. I ran away from home, and I got brought back again. My father gave me a lecture and ended up by ordering me upstairs to take off all my clothes. He took a strap and gave me a sound licking. It hurt me. Did yours?
He wants like play-by-play.
Another letter says, Friend Will, I think you ought to tell me the answers to the questions I asked you in my last letter. Don't be afraid of answering, for I only want to see if you know what I did to those boys on Powder Hill. Answer in full all you know about it, and I will tell you if you're right. Tell me some more of your floggings, for I want something to talk about. Tell me, as I have told you of my 2 floggings, tell me if they hurt, and how your father did it. I hope you do not do anything bad to yourself while you're in here. You understand what I mean, don't you? I mean playing with yourself or abusing yourself. I'm glad you prayed last night. Yours truly, Jesse.
Damn, Jesse's got a screw loose. Big time.
Now it's talking about masturbating.
Yes, exactly. I hope you didn't do it. But if you did, tell me all about it.
In another letter he sent to his friend Willie, he described some of the murders to Willie. He said, quote, You asked me to tell you why I did those things and what I said to the boy and girl. First of all, I bet Willie didn't ask. I bet he just wants to share it with Willie. He says, quote, The girl came into the store one morning and asked for paper. I told her there's a store downstairs, and she went down, and I killed her. Oh, Willie, you don't know how bad I feel for her, and also the boy. What I said to the boy I have no recollection, but you know I killed him too. I feel very bad for him. And believe me, I can't tell you the reasons I did those things. He's a very prolific writer, so here's another real quick one. Dear Will, I met the boys and I took them up the hill and I beat them, but I don't remember sticking pins or knives in them or putting salt water in their backs. That was an excerpt. So friend Willie is going to go to the reformatory that worked really well for Jesse. And in his departing letter, Jesse wrote him one more time. It says, "Friend Willie, I hope you will behave up there, for if you do, you will get out soon." True and accurate.
Pro tip.
If you don't, you'll get a good flogging every time you don't do right. Don't do anything bad to yourself. You know what I mean, don't you, Willie?
Wink, wink, hint, hint.
Don't mind the boys up there. They will plague you at first and ask you to do bad things. If you do, you'll get a whipping with a strap. How do you feel today, Willie? I am well. Did you undress and pray last night? I took off all my clothes except my shirt, and I prayed too. Tell me all. Your friend forever.
I don't want Jesse to be my friend forever.
Again, the state of Massachusetts wasn't sure what to do with Jesse, but eventually they agreed that death wasn't the answer. So instead, they sentenced him to life in solitary confinement.
That's harsh. I think I'd rather be put to death.
Yes! That's like hell.
I know.
Jesse spent the next 41 years in solitary confinement.
Wow.
He spent his time reading and learning and trying to escape, but he never did. And in around like the 1950s, he started getting a little famous because he was in solitary confinement. All these people were being activists in a sense, and he was kind of becoming a celebrity. After 41 years in solitary confinement and a lot of protesting, his sentence was commuted to simply life. After 53 years in prison, when Jesse was very frail, as a humanitarian sort of gesture, they transferred him into a very low security prison to live out his days. In order to get to this new prison, he had to drive, and that was the first time he'd been in a vehicle. And this was the first time he'd seen the world in 53 years. When the guards started driving him, he asked them where all the horses were. You had a look of, like, sad sympathy.
It's just pathetic.
You know what? That's a perfect word. It is pathetic. The guards stopped. They got him a ginger ale and some ice cream. About 2 years later, on September 29th of 1932, Jesse died in prison of heart disease at the age of 72.
Wow, he lived a long time in prison.
Basically, the long short of it is he was a psychopath. He never ended up having any real empathy. Some think it could be a result of some brain damage that occurred with that illness when he was little that made him blind.
Wow, I've never heard of Jesse Pomeroy.
I hadn't either. I don't want to hear any more about him. I've had my fill. You can only read so much torture of children before enough is enough. Well, I want to thank you, Tanya, for taking some time out of your day to spend it with me and learn about Jesse. I wish that we could understand human nature and what makes some people like this and some people not. Because Jesse, yeah, his dad flogged him, but he said it wasn't very often. I mean, they're flogging in the schools. You heard him in the letters.
So, Talia, where can everyone find us?
They can find us on Instagram at TNT Crimes. We have Twitter, though. We're working on that.
Yes, we're working on Twitter. We also are on Facebook.
Oh, yes, Facebook. And then our website, tntcrimes.com.
If you go to our website, there is a member area. If you'd like to join, there are unreleased episodes that you can have access to, or those episodes are available for purchase.
Yes, they are. So thank you, everybody, from the bottom of our hearts.
Absolutely. We love you all for listening.
We can't thank you guys enough. And thank you to all our followers.
Until next week.
Until next week. It's going to be amazing next week, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.